Okay. Hi everyone and welcome to our webinar this evening. We are joined by Mike Moser and Dr. Tracey Hamston, and they will both be giving us wonderful presentations this evening on all things wildflower meadows on various scales. What you can expect from the evening, Mike is going to kick us off with some information about biodiversity loss across the biosphere, and then talk about the nature recovery plan. And Dr. Tracey Hamston is here to represent More Meadows, and she'll be discussing the More Meadows group and the North Devon Biosphere group forum that you can join. I'll be talking about next steps, and I've realised I haven't introduced myself. My name's Emily Willoughby. I'm the Pledge for Nature coordinator with the North Devon Biosphere. So we're bringing this webinar to you from Pledge for Nature with the Biosphere and More Meadows. So without further ado, Mike, I'd like to invite you to unmute your microphone and share the screen. For those of you that haven't heard Mike Moser do a presentation before on the Nature Recovery Plan, Mike is chair of the Nature Improvement Group with the North Devon Biosphere, coordinated the creation of the Nature Recovery Plan and is really involved in its implementation, which is brilliant. Vice chair of Devon Wildlife Trust and has a significant input into my project, which is Pledge for Nature. So thank you, Mike. I'll let you take it away.
Great, thank you, Em. Good evening, everybody, and it's great to see so much interest in meadow making. That's the season. I guess none of you, I'm sure, will doubt the severity of the ecological and climate emergencies that are facing the planet. But when we look at the gorgeous landscapes that we have here in Northern Devon, it's not surprising that across the public, there's perhaps not that much awareness as to the very serious state that our nature is in. But there are some really clear indicators. If we look at our woodland cover at about 13% across the Biosphere Reserve, that's the same as the UK, and the UK is one of the least wooded countries in the European Union, in the European area. If we look at the state of our rivers, 85% of the rivers, according to the state of our rivers, 85% of the sections that the Environment Agency monitor in the Torrens catchments are failing ecological condition, and 100% of our rivers are failing in terms of chemical condition. And of course, the Atlantic salmon has been declining and is really getting towards the edge of local extinction. If we look at flower meadows, huge loss across the area in recent years. Take the cullen grasslands, which are the real speciality of the area, down 87% in area compared to the 1900 levels. And if we look at breeding birds across Devon and North Devon, more than twice as many species have either been lost or are in significant decline across this area compared to species that have arrived or are increasing. So these are really, really serious indicators that we've got. That our environment is in this state matters. It matters because nature is really important in its own right, but it also matters because it underpins the whole economy of the North Devon area. It also provides all the regulation of air, soils, and water, which make this such a great place to live. The state of the environment also matters because we are really fortunate in having been recognized by UNESCO as one of the World Biosphere Reserves. This was 20 years ago. And that was because of the quality of our natural environment. And so, the fact that our natural environment is fading and is disappearing in front of our eyes is really significant. The good news is that the Biosphere Reserve brings an approach to being used as a test bed for looking at sustainable approaches to managing the environment and economy. And that's brought together a very large number of organizations to work across this area, which covers the catchments of the Torrens systems and the offshore areas out to Lundy. So a really interesting area. And one of the elements that we've been working on as a big partnership is to look at how we can address this loss of nature. And for the last year and a half, we've been working on a nature recovery plan. We started with more than 50 experts working together in the design of the plan by looking at the root causes of nature loss across the terrestrial parts of the area. We didn't look at the marine at this stage. And this slide just summarizes the main reasons that we came up with, looking across all the taxa, the amphibians, the reptiles, the lichens, the flowers, everything. And these were the key things: historical habitat conversion over many centuries in many cases, but also in more recent times. And then more recently, particularly, intensification of land use. And that's been really important and has also been exacerbated by increasing use of nutrients, which has led to eutrophication of some of the river systems, and biocides in the fields, which are obviously affecting plants and insects. And these trends have been affected also by climate change. And you can see down below an extreme example where the effects are a loss and decline of species, a loss of the dynamism and the functionality of the landscape, soil degradation, and all of this leading to impacts on the freshwater ecosystems. Just looking at the Biosphere Reserve from the sky inland, this is a section of the middle tour, and it just illustrates some of the key issues. Our woodlands, very low woodland cover, many of them artificial conifer plantations, extremely fragmented, some of them joined together by hedgerows, but of course our hedgerows also being increasingly heavily managed. The grasslands, extremely intensively managed for dairy, a lot of arable land with maize and other crops being grown on them, with very intensive use. And our wetlands, really looking at the river system here, the river floodplain wetlands hardly exist any longer. There's just a very narrow ribbon of the river Tor running through the middle there, with hardly any buffer strip adjacent to it in most areas. So these are significant problems for wildlife. So our nature recovery plan that we've now designed and started implementing this year really aims to, over the next 10 years, so by 2030, to really try and bring nature back into recovery mode across this area. And it's divided into 5 action plans covering these different habitat types that are shown here. And really excitingly, this year, a separate group, the marine group, has been working to add a new nature recovery plan for marine habitats as well. And each of these plans identifies the priorities for nature and what needs to be done. And really, there are 4 key strategies that are in here. The first is about making space for nature across the area, more space for nature, through habitat restoration and creation. It's about expanding the area of woodlands, of grasslands, flower-rich grasslands, and of wetlands, connecting these areas and trying to soften some of the edges between them. At the moment, the habitats are very fragmented with very hard edges between them. The second strand is about species recovery and reintroductions, and this looks at some of the Devon special species like the dormouse, some of the species that are under threat like the shorebirds on the Torridge estuary, which are very threatened in winter by disturbance, and a really exciting program for reintroduction of species, things like beavers on the rivers, which we want to have in very soon, and water voles down on Braunton, and several other really exciting species. The third strand is about integrating nature into the farmland and urban areas, and that's really about using the agricultural subsidies that are available to really target priority actions for nature. And then in the urban environment, using the planning mechanisms much more effectively to build nature-friendly new residential areas and to improve the existing areas. And then finally, the fourth strand of the plan is about engagement and collaboration. And this is really a recognition that the conservation organizations that are working on this plan, they've been working their socks off for the last decades, and yet we've not been able to hold the tide of nature decline. And the only way that the tide is going to be turned is by really engaging the community right across the board, from businesses to farmers, to local community groups, to people in their gardens, to churches, to wherever else. So we've really got to try and engage everyone, and that's what this process is all about. Now, the Nature Recovery Plan has quite a focus on flower-rich, species-rich grasslands. It crops up in several of the plans and in several priority actions. And that is because these habitats were previously so important to the biodiversity, the nature of the area. If we look across the Culm measures, these flower-rich grasslands are really typical of them, and the Culm grassland, the Rose pastures, which I'm sure Tracey will mention, they are a really important habitat in European terms, and is something that we really need to try and expand. So these habitats, they support a fantastic biodiversity from the invertebrates in the soils and above the soils, the flowers themselves, reptiles, amphibians, bird populations, mammals, etc. Really rich habitats, and of course incredibly important for pollinators in particular. But they also play a really important role in terms of water and carbon storage. There's really good evidence now that these habitats, the flower-rich grasslands, the Culm grasslands particularly, when compared to intensively managed grassland, store very significant amounts more carbon and water. So that's another really important role. So I just picked out here some of the actions which are listed in the Nature Recovery Plan. And the first one is all about protecting what's left, because there isn't that much left, and really important to look after that and make sure we don't lose any more of it. And then the next four actions, or next three actions rather, are all about recreation and restoration, both of high value semi-natural grassland and also semi-improved grassland from intensive grassland. So it's trying to move as much as we can up the scale of nature-rich grassland. The fourth item is about creating species-rich wet grassland, really important, particularly for the Culm areas. And then the fifth one is about urban areas where there is tremendous potential to improve nature across gardens, public spaces, schools, churchyards, business premises for nature gain. And obviously putting wildflower patches into these is really important. And then finally, the last one is about verges, and we've got really good support from the councils in trying to move this forward. And I think there's great potential there as well, both for the councils and for community action. So you've not come to listen to me because I'm not the specialist on grasslands. You've come to listen to Tracey, so I'm going to hand on to her in a second. But just to say, there are two things that you could do after this this webinar. One, it would be really helpful if you haven't already done so to sign our Nature Recovery Declaration. That's getting people behind the Nature Recovery Plan across the area. We've had over 500 signatures. We've got loads of businesses, loads of organizations have signed up to it. If you haven't signed it, please go onto the Biosphere website, very easy to find, and sign the declaration. And then the other thing, of course, is about taking action. And we hope that Tracey's talk will stimulate lots of action. And please tell us what you're doing. Put it up on the Biosphere system as a pledge for nature, whether it's in your garden, a verge, whether it's fields. What we're after is action to try and turn this tide against loss of nature. So with that, I'll hand back to Emily, and Tracey will take over.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mike. If I can ask you to stop sharing your screen, that would be brilliant.
Done.
So now I'd like to introduce you to our guest speaker, Tracey. Tracey is here representing More Meadows. She's a conservation officer and chairs her own community conservation group. As a key member of the More Meadows Forum, of the More Meadows group, she was instrumental in helping set up the More Meadows Forum, which is something that you'll be hearing about shortly. Tracey, if I could invite you to share your screen.
Okay, if I can find the thing. There we go.
Thanks.
Okay. And some slides should be on their way. Okay, are we good?
Brilliant. Yeah, that's all good.
Cool. So I shall shift past this one. So I'm here today really to represent More Meadows, but to really tell you a little bit about the group, but not too much, because what I want to do is to promote our forum, which is all about sort of networking people and getting people together, obviously to restore, create, protect wildflower meadows in whatever form they are. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and obviously want to have a little think about what you can do. So there's a few fundamental kind of principles, and they mostly apply to large or small patches, but the way you might go about them might be a little bit different in different circumstances. But because it's quite a big subject, I've got a few links that I think Emily would email you, or I can put in the chat at the end. And really, I would like you to ask some questions, really, because I think that everyone has their quite particular questions around this, and they might have their own kind of scenario or their own patch, really, with quite specific questions. So I'm hoping that that's where we're going to go. So where do we start? So this is myself and Donna Cox, who's the chair of More Meadows. So More Meadows with the double O, as in Dartmoor, was the sort of founding group, if you like, that popped up some years ago. And More Meadows, people get a bit confused with the spelling, but that's really this whole Meadow Makers Forum and the idea that we can network people right across Devon. So that's what that group is about. So as Emily kindly said, I've been involved with sort of grassland restoration and monitoring in one form or another for about 14 years. And I joined More Meadows as a way really to find out more about what other people were doing. And I went to a really inspiring talk by George Peterkin in our local village hall in 2015, and basically signed up right then. Thought, wow, this is really exciting. There's a group getting together to sort of swap notes, really, and inspire each other. So if I give you a little bit, this is a little bit about More Meadows. I'm going to dwell too much, but basically it's a community initiative. It's a coming together of like-minded people. I think often they were people that maybe weren't supported perhaps by sort of stewardship schemes and things. So they may have had land of various sizes, wanted to do something for nature in the context that Mike has already talked about. I really kind of didn't really know the best way forward, you know, whether they should be restoring things or leaving things be or what they should do. So it was very much a desire to link together. And I think often people felt a little bit like they were trying to do something that was a bit against the grain. You know, they might be looking over their hedge and seeing a very intensively managed grassland, and they didn't want that. So it was kind of linking people with these kind of similar thought process. So that's really what it was about. I just sort of say that, so that's a little bit of a glimpse of the website, which I will put the link in at the end. The website has quite a lot of stuff on it. I would say have a look. This is just a little screenshot of one of the resource pages, which actually expanded quite a lot during COVID, I have to say, because we went a bit crazy like a lot of people did and developed lots of online resources. So there's quite a lot of online talks and videos and that kind of things. And I think Emily also put in her write-up for this talk about where to get seed from. So there's a little bit of information about that sort of thing on there. I'll touch on that a bit later on. So I would urge you to have a bit of a look. So as I say, More Meadows sprung up 2015, and it kind of expanded quite rapidly, and then particularly over the last kind of 2 or 3 years it really exploded, and suddenly people were joining from all over Devon, because a lot of the talks were based around Dartmoor. It was quite a lot of the topics were quite relevant for Dartmoor. It's kind of, wow, there's a lot of need for this out there, but actually wouldn't it be great if we could have more groups like More Meadows, but in different places all over Devon, all kind of talking to each other, but coming together and swapping notes and kind of looking at each other's land and learning about what they can do for nature on their land. And actually it expands beyond the sort of meadow concept. People that have got some bit of grassland have often got hedges or trees or ponds and all the other sort of things as well. So people were kind of talking to each other about that. We had an email group, so that got very big, and it was becoming a little bit unwieldy as well. So we were kind of wondering how we could sort of expand what we were doing, but sort of try and provide something that was a bit more fit for purpose. So we came up with this idea for an online forum. So we had a grant from the Devon Environment Foundation. And some of you might be familiar with online forums. They're quite a popular thing. They've been around for quite a long time. But we wanted something that we could expand within, that we could provide different spaces for different groups. And this is a screenshot of the North Devon Biosphere group, which I hope you'll all be joining. So it's a platform, it's an online platform for communications, and it has facilities to share resources, share photos. Lots of people put up pictures, ID queries and all that kind of thing on there. In fact, there's all sorts of things. You can have whole conversations on there. It's much more, and we looked at things like Facebook, and that didn't really cut it, to be honest. So this is a more focused kind of way of communicating that's sort of for people who want to have those kind of conversations, really, rather than perhaps just look at some passing images of something. And so we were really keen to try and promote these kind of regional groups. So again, you can have a look at the forum. I've put a link at the end. You don't have to join to have a look, but if you want to actually sort of join up or post anything, then you do need to join. But it's quite a simple registration form, and then you can post anywhere in the forum. But because we've got these kind of regional groups, it means that there are areas. If you're really wanting to talk to somebody locally about something, you might be looking for a bit of machinery, or looking for some local seed or whatever, or you might just have a nice story or a picture of your patch that you want to share. It's quite nice to actually use the groups a little bit more like that. And the other idea was to bring people together and to perhaps do open meadows, which I think you might be promoting that. I've got a feeling, Emily. So I can see some nods. So, and that's really popular. So in fact, you've got sharp eyes, you can see Steve Pollard's name on there. So he's the person who promotes the More Meadows, open meadows. And that's really a chance for people just to open up their bits of land, whatever they may be, for a day, for a couple of days, for a week, whatever they feel like, and invite anyone who would like to go and look round. And people really enjoy that. They like going to see what other people are doing. I think they're generally quite nosy anyway. So and get ideas and find out actually what individual people's journeys were to achieve some of the things, some of the sort of amazing meadows that they have. And they're all stages, so people don't have to feel that they've got some spectacular kind of meadow to kind of take part. But I think it's very popular. So we've got quite a few groups on there. If you go and have a look, I think probably the furthest along is our West Devon group. So one of their aims was really to try and join people up with bits of land to try and create corridors in the area. And they've even started up their own steering group, and they've got, I think, someone from Devon Wildlife Trust on there, research students, some local councillors. So anyone really with a little patch can kind of join into these things. So yeah, so that was kind of the aims of the forum, really, to give this kind of this platform. So if we talk a little bit more about meadows, which is kind of what we're here for. So where do they come from? So Mike gave us a really good kind of overview of some of the things that we might see in Devon, but you know, where do these things come from? And these are a few quite typical meadow flowers here. We've got Germander speedwell, bugle, bulbous buttercup and things. And many of them have been around in the UK from before the last ice age, so from pollen deposits. That we know that these things have been in our landscape for a very long time. And these would have been present in the landscape in forest clearings that would probably been kept open by grazing herbivores, sort of marshy areas where perhaps other things couldn't get a hold, often where soils are quite thin, so it won't support more scrubby and woodland type vegetation. You would have these kind of mixes of wildflowers. And as time went on and people came and farmed the landscape, these meadows became part of the agricultural system. Mostly we tend to think of them that they would have been grasslands that were cut for hay to provide winter fodder for animals, but they would also have been grazed as well. And probably a lot of them may not have been permanent grasslands. They may well have been part of a sort of small scale mixed farming system as they sort of rotated around. So we have this kind of very long history really of association with many of these plants. There's a little bit of a discussion about what is a meadow, and I'm not going to dwell on this too much because I don't think it's overly important particularly, but it kind of depends on what your perspective is. So typically people talk about hay meadows, grasslands that were cut for hay production, so they would be cut to provide that winter fodder, and they were often grazed afterwards, so the regrowth would have been grazed down, and pastures tend to just be grazed. But actually what we find is that from an ecologist, I guess, or conservationist perspective, the interest really lies in the sort of nature, the species rich nature of certain grasslands. So I just put some of these kind of grasslands that we might think about. And the key sort of thing is whether the plants are allowed to flower and seed within those grasslands, because obviously, as Mike already mentioned, they're really important and support many pollinators. And then, you know, they're that part of the food chain, then insectivorous birds and bats and so forth. So having those flowering plants in there that are then able to cross-pollinate with each other and then set seed and perpetuate themselves is quite important. So whether it's cut, grazed or both, these days they're very much a habitat that's quite dependent on the activities of man and our livestock. And people often talk about sort of rewilding of meadows, but actually if you leave them, most of them will eventually turn, as you probably know, will probably turn to scrub and then woodland. Both great habitats, but you will lose your kind of that flower rich kind of interest. So could we consider humans in this case to be a keystone species? I don't know. So I put a few things on there. Mike mentioned culm grassland, so obviously that's quite a specific type of habitat, which is certainly relevant to bits of Dartmoor and certainly up in your neck of the wood. But areas, we have a few areas of calcareous grassland, very species rich, often very limited in its sort of growth really because of the very thin soils and the underlying sort of limestone or base rich rocks that you have. Not so much down here, but certainly in the rest of the UK there are water meadows, which are one of those ones that are actually quite fertile but enormously species rich. Find them along sort of riverbanks, and they go through a sort of a cycle of being flooded and grazed. But there's also all those other spaces, and many of those are probably remnants of meadows that may well have been there in the past. So if we think about our roadside verges, you know, when animals were moved around, so drovers moving livestock across the landscape. They would have been grazing the verges. Some of them would have been part of those meadows that sit now behind hedges, perhaps, and things. And often, you know, we've got some fantastic roadside verges, and we've probably got some fantastic ones that are there waiting to be released from cutting regimes, or abandoned cutting as the opposite end of the scale. But also within woodlands, rides, glades, so open areas of grassland in those kind of settings, and orchards. Something that we've been talking about a lot lately is having the idea of having a more wood pasture kind of setting, where you've got quite relatively species rich grass and with occasional trees in, and some orchards really fulfill that kind of function. So lots of places you might find these, and the number of species within these really depends quite a lot on the soil type, particularly the fertility of the soil, which I'll mention again in a minute, but also the management, and that can be the current management or the historic management. And often you can have a guess when you walk through a grassland, some of the semi-improved grassland that Mike sort of alluded to, which may not be particularly species rich, but they're sort of somewhere in the middle really, and you can kind of guess what they've been used for before. There's sort of, you know, indications, you know, if things have been heavily kind of horse grazed and that sort of thing, and you can sometimes see in there whether a bit of a change of management is likely to sort of bring forth a bit more in the terms of species diversity. So we often talk about meadows as wildflower meadows or hay meadows, and some people are even creating them in their gardens, so it's very popular. So if we just think about meadows today, can be in all sorts of different places. They can all look very different, and they are ever changing as well. They're not a static thing, and anyone that's got some grassland with lots of lovely species in it will know that it's an ever-changing kind of palette of the species that they have, with things dominating and disappearing and coming back again. So they're quite interesting actually. So this is actually Frowley Churchyard in North Dartmoor, which is now a county wildlife site. It must be on the small end of that, but it's amazing. And there's about at least 3 or 4 different areas of the churchyard that are all quite different from each other. So it's really quite a great place to go and visit, I would say. This is a picture of Steve Pollard, who's a More Meadows steering group member, and this is him in one of his amazing meadows. So he's a farmer, so this is on a sort of farming scale, and has some really amazing meadows full of all sorts of orchids, which he's very proud of, and he opens his meadows every year. So again, he's up near Chagford, so definitely worth a visit. And even a garden shed roof. So you can have a little meadow anywhere. And I think that's what this is all about, is really trying to find those little scraps and spaces where you can actually create something that's really great for nature. So a few kind of little nuts and bolts, I suppose, really, that's worth thinking about when you're thinking about, worth asking yourself, really, I think, when you're thinking about what you're going to do with your land, whether that's a garden or something much bigger, and how you might manage it is going to depend on the answers to some of those sort of questions as well. You know, what's that sort of time, what sort of size piece of grassland have you got? Things about cutting and grazing times are things you might need to think about, and how you, if you want to add in species, how might you do that? What's the best kind of way? And also, I think it's always good to have a little look around you, even in a garden. I think that connectivity of our landscape is so important. And if you can do something in your garden, how great would it be if both your neighbours can also do that? And then suddenly you're creating something that has, you know, extra added value to wildlife. So in terms of really species rich grassland, we do have to be sensible, and I'm not saying that that the best land has to be species rich. You might not have that, but you can still make it brilliant for nature. So let's just sort of get that one out of the way, really. But there are certain grasslands that are more suitable than others, and there are things that you can do to try and make things more suitable as well. So it's a good idea just to think about, is it suitable? And I think what's really important before you do anything is what do you have already, actually. I see people, well, in fact, it's something that quite often happens. People may buy some land, they don't really know what to do with it. They come to us, say, oh, I'm planning to plough it all up and sow some wildflower seed. You're there, oh, no, don't do that. With the best of intentions, just leave it a year, leave it uncut for a summer, and just have a look at what you've got already, because you might have something that's halfway there, or you might even have something, and I've seen this, that's absolutely spectacular, and someone's gone and planted a load of oak trees in it. So don't do anything, have a look at what you've got and think about what you want to achieve as well. I think particularly that is the case in a garden setting, perhaps. You know, what are there other factors you might need to think about, other people that use that space, and that might also apply to some community sort of areas as well. And then you can think about what you might do. Is it a sort of more of a restorative, gentle restorative process, or is it a kind of, right, we need to go back to basics and try and create something here? So on a, this is just very quick, on a bigger scale, there's, in terms of creating wildflower rich habitat, there's currently some FIPL, Farming Protective Landscape grants around that cover that. I would say test your soil, and that actually is quite a useful thing to do if you've got a garden as well. It's always worth doing. For sort of, I guess, quicker results, and that there is a time element, I think, to this, depending on what you want to do. If you've got quite low phosphate levels, so if you're not very familiar with nutrients for plants, phosphate, so superphosphate, which is what gets chucked onto a lot of very improved grassland and other land, stays around for a very long time. So it really feeds hungry plants and vigorous grasses that people cut for silage, absolutely mop up, you know, high levels of fertilizer, and that will be to the expense of pretty much everything else. So if you've got quite high phosphate levels, you'll probably find you don't have that many species, and you'll have mostly grasses there. You'll have mostly quite competitive grasses that are able to really kind of make the most of those nutrients, and the other things that can't really compete against that are kind of either not there or they're sort of struggling. So there's quite a few places that do soil testing. You can take it to like Mole Valley Farmers or some equivalent where they'll give you a little rundown. I would say, just trying to think, we've got quite a good plant life video, which is all about how to test your soil. It's good to take a few samples from a few places, and you take it from below the surface. And if you've got different types of patches, if it looks a bit different, it's good to take samples you know, from different areas, so you can get an idea across your land, because what you might find is some places it's going to be really hard, and other places might lend themselves quite well to some gentle sort of restoration. And time as well. People have different expectations here. Certainly a meadow that I've been involved with the restoration of for, well, I've not been involved with it for 20 years. I've been there sort of 10 years, I think, but it's been literally changed. The only change that happened here was an old horse paddock. So it was quite full of big tussocks of kind of competitive grasses, was actually quite fertile. So it's actually still got relatively, not high phosphate, but not as low as perhaps you'd want. But all we did for years and years was just cut and take the grass clippings away. So it was a hay cut every year. Hay was taken away, and that's all we did. We did some little interventions in some test patches at some point, which were quite successful, and some of those spread a bit. but actually now it looks amazing. In fact, I think the picture that's behind my head is from that bit of grassland, which certainly you wouldn't have seen any of these flowers in those times. So that's quite a long scale. It's on quite fertile soil, took quite a long time. It depends. And someone said to me the other day, and I thought that was quite a nice thought. He says, I've done it slowly. He says, I've just slowly done this over time. He said, and the ecology has kept up. He said, just how he described it, of this quite gentle process towards something that he's got now, which is incredibly beautiful. And he feels that as it's slowly kind of changed, that things have moved in. He's got fantastic ant hills and all sorts of things in there. So it can be quite a slow process. There are things you can do to make it a bit quicker, but I think that patience is well rewarded in these circumstances. So how do you find out what you have? This is an ID workshop that we ran at Brimps Farm. We do have a few botanists on our website. You can do some, if you're quite into your wildflowers, you can perhaps have a look at some ID courses. We find actually a lot of people use the forum for this. They'll stick up pictures of things. Oh, what's this? What's in here? And there's always people on there that know quite a lot actually and are able to help them. And even if you don't actually know what they are, if you have a look at a piece of grassland like that and you can count, 10 different flowers, then you've probably got something that's quite interesting there. Even if you don't really know what they are, you kind of think, wow, look at all those different shaped and coloured flowers and different shaped leaves and things. So you don't necessarily have to know all of the plants. And again, the open meadows thing can be quite good. So the other side of it, I was just going to mention before we get on to what one might do. So if you have a bit of an idea of what species you might have, you've had a look at your phosphate levels perhaps, and you might have a big bit of land, you might have a garden, verge, or whatever it is. So there's various different strategies. So this is just a little ant's eye view of Donna's lawn outside her front garden, in her front garden, which is a very beautiful little spot. But this is what she calls her pop-up lawn. Which I thought was quite relevant at the moment. We're in the middle of May, and hopefully some of you are no-mow maying. And literally all she does is she doesn't mow. She mows a path through it and a little bit around the edge in places. And this is what it was like last year, I think, in the middle of summer. And it's absolutely full of bees and butterflies and wonderful things. So there's great merit to having a look at what you've got. And if you're lucky enough, and I'm not lucky enough unfortunately, but some people are lucky enough to have houses where they've inherited grassland that's probably actually been part of a meadow in the past, and you can just, if you just look down into all the green shapes, even if you're not sure what they are, if you can see lots of things that aren't grasses in there, or even lots of different coloured grasses, they will have slightly different thicknesses of leaf and shades of green, then it's probably got some interesting things there, and definitely well worth lifting your mower up, even if it's just for a month of May, just to give it a bit of a breather and having a look at what's there. And you can be really surprised. And I know places where they've done this that have been mowed to a bowling green for years. They've changed the mowing regime, and a few years later it's thick with orchids and all sorts of wonderful things. So you kind of never really know what things might pop up from your lawn. If you've kind of gone down this route and you think, well, actually I haven't really got a great deal, and I'd quite like to get some more species in, then there are things that you can do. So if your phosphates are reasonably low, I mean, I think in a garden you can be less hung up a bit about the phosphate thing, because you can tinker with it to an extent, and you can add things in, which is sort of fairly easy. So this is obviously a bigger scale picture, and the idea here is it's not being ploughed, that's actually being cut really, really close in that situation. I think there's a few passes. with a flail mower and collector to really kind of almost scalp the ground. And you can do that in your garden or on a verge with a lawn mower. And I would say you can do it in patches as well. You can do little spots or strips. It can be quite a daunting task to do a huge big area, and actually things will colonize from strips of kind of restored areas quite well. You do need to have fairly good soil contact if you're going to put seed on there. So they sort of say, you know, 50% bare ground is what you're trying to aim for. And the idea, you can do this a bit later on in the summer. So I'm going to talk about how you might get seed in, because that's kind of what's going to guide you a little bit as to when you might do this. There's various ways of getting different species into a patch of land. So people often think of seed first, because it's probably the easiest thing. You know, you can buy seed and then you can sprinkle it on. I would say that it's reasonably important to look at provenance, particularly if you're out in a more rural area. So think about where your seed is coming from. The best way actually is what that lady's doing in the top right there. And she's got a whole bunch of green hay. So this is when hay is cut on species rich meadow, and before it's allowed to dry, so pretty much straight away, it gets collected up and then transported to the site that you've prepared. So like that one in the previous image. And then she's got a prepared site there. She's spreading that green hay everywhere, and then you leave it to dry. And what that does is it gives you a whole selection of seeds. And because you've got it from locally, you kind of it has to be spread within 2 or 3 hours, or it starts heating up and killing the seeds off. So it has to be quite a quick process. But you get the whole array. So you get rare things in there as well, things that may only be, you know, present in small amounts. And that's really great. There are some local, there's not very many suppliers that I know of wildflower seed sort of in Devon. There's Goran Farm, which is in East Devon, which is someone that we recommend quite a bit. He gets very busy. I think it's another thing to put onto the forum, but it's a big process producing wildflower seed. So the green hay, if you can do it, it's great. Plug plants, I've just put those in the bottom, so that was just an idea. Actually, I've grown plug plants from collected seed in a meadow before, grown them myself and then put them in my garden, and that works brilliantly. And we've put them in our local verges as well, the roadside verges here in Buckfastleigh. It works on small scale. Obviously it's a bit labour intensive for a big patch, but great. And yellow rattle, we can't have a talk about meadows without talking about yellow rattle. So that's that lovely yellow plant up on the top left there. It's a great source of pollen and nectar for insects, but it's also one of a group of plants that are hemiparasitic. So they actually, their roots tap into the roots of other plants and they sort of extract sugars and things. And what that does is it can reduce the vigor of those plants, and depending on what they are, that varies. But one of the things it does is it will reduce the vigor of quite vigorous grasses. So some of those grasses that I mentioned earlier that can suppress other things. And it's an annual, so it can kind of really knock back some of those grasses, and then it dies off at the end of the year and you end up with little bare patches. And sometimes it's good to do that first before thinking about adding some other seed, because actually you've already got it into a bit more of a receptive state. There's lots and lots of information about yellow rattle, and it's an endless source of conversation, I would say, on the forum as well. So this is an example of a meadow that was grown from bought seed. So you can do it on a big scale and you can create something truly amazing. Just a little whiz through some general principles about management. So the key thing is keeping that fertility low. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to leave grass cuttings on the top of your meadow, because they will add fertility back into the soil. So if you cut, you always remove all your cuttings, whether that's as hay or whether it's in a small patch, you rake it off. People talk about what time they might like to do that, and that can be a bit of personal choice depending on what pressures there are on that grassland. But generally, if you're looking at it from a wildlife point of view, late is quite good. It allows a lot of invertebrates to complete their life cycles. And sometimes if you've got the option to do some cutting at different times in different places, because you'll favour different species and you end up with quite a nice mix potentially. We like to leave refuges for insects. A hay cut is quite a cataclysmic event for invertebrates, because obviously you're taking away everything from that meadow. So you can leave some strips around the edge or perhaps a patch in the middle. And people will often graze after that, maybe right up until the spring. And some people actually graze instead of doing any cutting at all. And in fact, this picture of this anthill is on a site where they don't ever cut, they haven't cut for 18 years. They just put ponies in there over the winter, and that's it. And these are beautiful. This is about 1 metre high, this anthill. It was amazing. It's only appeared since he's been there and since he's been managing it like that. And it would obviously, you know, wouldn't be there if you were cutting that every year. So I'm not going to go into the different grazing and different animals. That's a whole another big thing. So just a bit of a pinched photo of a bit of a meadow here, and just to point out that you've got things to consider. You probably wouldn't want to cut that slope. You've got a slope, you might have climate. Some people can't cut hay up on the moor because we don't get the weather necessarily. Access for machinery and livestock, all those things you might need to consider. I thought I might have to put a picture in with one of our scything workshops. So this is something that's proved very popular. And a lot of people have really switched to this, especially for managing and cutting small sites with limited access. It's great, very popular. Takes a bit of practice, but people seem to quite enjoy it. And I think it's possibly something that may be offered in an area near you sometime soon. So just to finish up with a couple of main points, is that idea of having fairly low fertility and maintaining that by removing your cuttings. And as Mike says, there's lots of opportunities of all sizes for you to grab a patch of ground, obviously with the permissions and all the rest of it, but to look at how you can transform little bits of grassland into little havens for wildlife. And these are just some pictures of around here. So this is a couple of our roadside verges that we've been working on. One's the edge of our rugby field in Buckfastleigh. One is my new pond in my garden that sits in my little mini meadow. So you can kind of, create these things wherever the will is there. And I've got some links there, but I will put those into the chat and I'll finish there. So thanks very much. And sorry if I ran on a bit.
No, you're all good. Thank you so much, Tracey. That was super interesting. Feeling pretty inspired from that, to be honest. So thank you very much.
Excellent.
I'm just going to share my screen again. I'm just going to quickly run over just consolidate some next steps for you all that are here listening. I'll just put that in full screen mode. So just to really echo what Mike and Tracey have reiterated throughout the presentations, the More Meadows Forum is there for you to explore, join, ask questions and kind of discuss with people that have had experience of making meadows or questions before. So please do have an explore and join the forum. If you are interested in other environmental aspects in your community, please reach out to your local community group. There are loads across the biosphere, including Sustainable Cholmondeley, Winkley Biodiversity Group, Regen Braunton. If you're not sure if there's one for you, please get in touch with the Biosphere and we'll try and put you in contact with a member of the community that's really leading the front on sustainability within the area. As Mike said, please go onto the Pledge for Nature website and create a pledge. If any of you are doing No Mow May or are indeed creating meadows, then please do add it. You can be added to our ever-growing network of pledge makers across the biosphere, and we've actually reached 1,000 pledges now. So we'll be celebrating that on our social media channels and such next week. So that's brilliant. Sign the Nature Recovery Declaration. I'll send out some information about that in a follow-up email. If you have successful meadows in your land and you'd like to open it up to the public, you can please also get in touch with us about maybe hosting some people that would like to learn from you. More meadows are due to post a schedule of open meadows shortly, so do keep an eye out on their website, and also we'll be sharing lots of it on our social media as well, so that's through the North Devon Biosphere social media channels. In terms of future events, No May and this webinar have been part of a seasonal activity from Pledge for Nature, and the next events we're hoping to offer will be on that wildflower identification, as Tracey was mentioning. We're just trying to sort out some venues for those. Hopefully they'll take place mid to end June, mid to the end of June, so keep an eye out on our socials, but if we do get them organised before the time I send you the follow-up email, then you might have that information ready for you there. I'm just going to look at the chat. I see we have a few questions. I'm just going to stop sharing. I believe Kim had a question. Why does opening up bare soil not just result in docks? Tracey, if you could answer that one for us.
It might do if you've got lots of docks there, I have to say. So disturbing the soil will disturb whatever's in your seed bank. But I would just measure that up with actually something that we've noticed at work. We kind of clear patches of some areas of limestone grassland actually where they scrub over, and so we disturb the seed bank there. A bunch of thistles come up. I see someone's mentioned thistles, I think. We don't do anything about them. We leave them, amazing nectar source for insects. They hang around for that year and maybe the next year, and then the grassland creeps back in, and probably by the third year they're pretty much gone actually completely. And docks are a bit more persistent, I have to say. So if you do have a lot of docks and you want to control them, there's various things you can do. Some people will dig them up, others if you just cut them when they're flowering before they seed. But bare soil doesn't inevitably mean you're going to get anything particular. It will reflect what's actually in your seed bank. So if you've got lots of docks nearby, you might want to think of cutting them back before you kind of open up your soil. And I kind of, as I've mentioned, these are quite dynamic landscapes, and actually we can be quite quick to go and spray off, or even I was just thinking, what's the term when you do the spot treat, things like thistles and things, and it depends how much you've got. And it depends on your personal preferences. I know people that really don't care, and they come and they go. It's quite a dynamic kind of system. And with that continued kind of cutting and removing, you might well find that your species mix and the nature of your grassland changes over time. Some people would look at spraying out some of those. I would say, and someone's put about nettles there, and there was something I've meant to mention and I didn't. When you're looking at whether your land is suitable, and in fact this is something that came up on the forum quite recently, someone had this, I've got this amazing patch, I want to do something with it. It's full of nettles and docks and it's really lush, and I'm going to make it sprinkle some wildflower seeds. The reason it's very lush and full of nettles and docks is because the fertility is really high, and it's probably where he had his muck heap before. And I said, you're probably best off having a vegetable patch there, to be honest, or doing something else. But trying to establish a wildflower meadow area on a patch like that is going to be really, really difficult. So think about perhaps other ways. On our meadow at work, actually, the one that's behind me, it's still got some really lush patches of tussocky grass, but actually as an overall landscape we've got quite a mix, and that gives a really nice habitat kind of mosaic. So some of those tall grasses and tall plants are really great for spiders and things, and then we'll get different invertebrates in some of the kind of shorter and more species rich. So just have a little look a bit closer and see what you've got. You never know what you might find lurking among your thistles. I think it's thistles actually that I don't have so much of a problem with. I think nettles and docks do tend to spell kind of a difficulty of trying to establish. I think people have a very fixed idea as well about what they want their wildflower meadow to look like, and they're never the same. You can go to lots of different sites and they'll all be slightly different because they'll reflect, you know, the underlying kind of soil and the, you know, climate and things. So you kind of do have to kind of go a bit with what you're going to get, what you've got.
Brilliant, thanks Tracey. I think Jade and Jay have asked similar questions. So Jade has asked, do you have to cut all grazer sites? Do you have to? And she's speaking on a small scale, such as a garden. Yeah. And then Jay's asked, how many times a year would you do this? And Jay, I'm assuming you're talking garden, or are you talking Jay stuff?
That's a good question, actually. How many times? So if you've got a patch, so actually this applies to some of our verges that we manage around here, they really weren't, we've got some that are quite nice, but we've got some other patches that are fortunately a lot smaller that weren't really that interesting, to be fair. And we started off cutting them actually a few times a year. So these are verges that someone had been over with a strimmer and all the cuttings had been left there, or they'd go on a ride on or something and they'd just leave it, and it would have been done to keep it tidy, you know, a few times a year. But they were quite fertile. So basically we started cutting it, and we did, the first year we did about 4 cuts actually, and we just kept taking the grass off every time. And then actually even within that 1 or 2 first years, and we're only like 3 years in, we started to see a difference in certain patches. So there were some areas that definitely it was starting to look different. We actually put some plug plants into some of those areas. We haven't really we added some seed last year, but we did the plug planting. But there's some patches I had a look at the other day, actually, they're quite rank still, they're quite tall. So what we might do, and this really works where you can tinker a bit more, is we might go in and cut some of those patches again, leave the sort of ones that are coming along, if you like, but cut back some of those kind of more vigorous things. Yes, definitely remove it. So even if it's your lawn and you're doing it with the lawnmower, put the box on the back or rake it off. That's for sure. My garden outside my house here is a bit rubbish, really, like that, and I've been doing that for years, and it's just slowly kind of getting a little bit better now. But I've got another patch that I tend to sort of tinker with a bit more, that's more interesting. So yeah, cut it. Do you have to cut or graze a site? If you leave any grassland, pretty much, unless it's really thin soils or on a cliff, or it's really, you know, inhospitable to scrub and trees, basically, that's what you will end up with if you don't cut it. So they are maintained as open grassland, really, by grazing or mowing of some description, really. So yes, you do, and in the garden